Hello, everyone. I'm Liz, and I'm back from the wars. How are you guys? I am about to read to you the main big chapter and the important chapter by a book called Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion by Emile Coué. He lived in France from 1857 to 1926, and he published this particular work in 1922. It is a really important work on healing of mind, body, and soul. And in it, he gives the suggestions, the exact verbiage that you can actually record for yourselves and listen to for yourselves. I'm actually going to record a meditation based on his verbiage after this chapter so that you have it, so you can listen to it. And you can get this little book on Kindle and read it for yourselves and record it for yourselves. But let's get going. He talks a little bit about helpful sleep. He talks somewhat about how to ease pain in the body immediately. And he has a whole verbiage and whole way that he helps clients feel better in mind, body, and soul. And he'll keep telling you he's not the healer. He actually talks about autosuggestion, where you begin to suggest to yourself your own healing. We're all always manifesting our world anyway, whether it's good or bad. So we may as well manifest good. And I'll put a timestamp to right about now as I begin to read. Suggestion, or rather autosuggestion, is quite a new subject. And yet, at the same time, it is as old as the world. It is new in the sense that until now, it has been wrongly studied and in consequence, wrongly understood. It is old because it dates from the appearance of man on the earth. In fact, he talks about Pythagoras and Aristotle talking about this in another work. And of course, it's in the Christian Bible. In fact, autosuggestion is an instrument that we possess at birth. And in this instrument, or rather in this force, resides a marvelous and incalculable power, which according to circumstances produces the best or the worst results. Knowledge of this force is useful to each one of us, but it is peculiarly, I can't say that word, peculiarly indispensable to doctors, magistrates, lawyers, and to those engaged in the work of education. By knowing how to practice it consciously, it is possible in the first place to avoid provoking in others bad autosuggestions which may have disastrous consequences. And secondly, consciously to provoke good ones instead, thus bringing physical health to the sick and moral health to the neurotic and the erring, the unconscious victims of anterior autosuggestions, and to guide into the right path those who had a tendency to take the wrong one. The conscious self and the unconscious self. In order to understand properly the phenomena of suggestion, or to speak more correctly of autosuggestion, it is necessary to know that two absolutely distinct selves exist within us. Both are intelligent, but while one is conscious, the other is unconscious. For this reason, the existence of the latter generally escapes notice. It is, however, easy to prove its existence if one merely takes the trouble to examine certain phenomena and to reflect a few moments upon them. Let us take, for instance, the following examples. Everyone has heard of somnambulism, sleepwalking. Everyone knows that a somnambulist gets up at night without waking, leaves his room after either dressing himself or not, goes downstairs, walks along corridors, and after having executed certain acts or accomplished certain work, returns to his room, goes to bed again, and shows the next day the greatest astonishment at finding work finished, which he had left unfinished the day before. It is, however, he himself who has done it without being aware of it. What force has his body obeyed if it is not an unconscious force, in fact, his unconscious self? Let us now examine the, alas, too frequent case of a drunkard attacked by delirium tremens. As though seized with madness, he picks up the nearest weapon, knife, hammer, or hatchet, as the case may be, and strikes furiously those who are unlucky enough to be in his vicinity. Once the attack is over, he recovers his senses and contemplates with horror the sense of carnage around him, without realizing that he himself is the author of it. Here again, it is not the unconscious self. Is it not the unconscious self which has caused the unhappy man to act in this way? Sorry, the archaic language just trips me up. And what aversions, what ills we create for ourselves, every one of us and in every domain by not immediately bringing into play good conscious autosuggestions against our bad unconscious autosuggestions, thus bringing about the disappearance of all unjust suffering. If we compare the conscious with the unconscious self, we see that the conscious self is often possessed of a very unreliable memory, while the unconscious self, on the contrary, is provided with a marvelous and impeccable memory, which registers without our knowledge the smallest events, the least important acts of our existence. Further, it is credulous and accepts with unreasoning docility what it is told. Thus, as it is the unconscious that is responsible for the functions of all of our organs, but the intermediary of the brain, a result is produced which may seem rather paradoxical to you. That is, if it believes that a certain organ functions well or ill, or that we feel such and such an impression, the organ in question does indeed function well or ill, or we do feel that impression. Not only does the unconscious self preside over the function of our organism, but also over all our actions, whatever they are. It is this that we call imagination, and it is this which, contrary to accepted opinion, always makes us act even, and above all, against our will when there is an antagonism between these two forces, will and imagination. If we open a dictionary and look up the word will, we find this definition: the faculty of freely determining certain acts. We accept this definition as true and unattackable, although nothing could be more false. This will that we claim so proudly always yields to the imagination. It is an absolute rule that admits of no exception. Blasphemy, paradox, you'll exclaim. Not at all. On the contrary, it is the purest truth, I shall reply. In order to convince yourself of it, open your eyes, look around you, and try to understand what you see. You will then come to the conclusion that what I tell you is not an idle theory, offspring of a sick brain, but the simple expression of a fact. Suppose we place on the ground a plank 30 feet long by 1 foot wide. It is evident that everybody will be capable of going from one end to the other of this plank without stepping over the edge. But now change the conditions of the experiment and imagine this plank placed at the height of the towers of a cathedral. Who will then be capable of advancing even a few feet along this narrow path? Could you hear me speak? Probably not. Before you had taken 2 steps, you would begin to tremble, and in spite of every effort of your will, you would be certain to fall to the ground. Why is it then that you would not fall if the plank is on the ground? And why should you fall if it's raised to a height above the ground? Simply because in the first case, you imagine that it is easy to get to the end of this plank, while in the second case, you imagine that you cannot do so. Notice that your will is powerless to make you advance. If you imagine that you cannot, it is absolutely impossible for you to do so. If tilers and carpenters are able to accomplish this feat, it is because they think they can do it. Vertigo is entirely caused by the picture we make in our minds that we are going to fall. This picture transforms itself immediately into the fact in spite of all the efforts of our will, and the more violent of these efforts are, the quicker is the opposite to the desired result brought about. Let us now consider the case of a person suffering from insomnia. If he does not make any effort to sleep, he will lie quietly in bed. If, on the contrary, he tries to force himself to sleep by his will, the more efforts he makes, the more restless he becomes. Have you not noticed that the more you try to remember the name of a person which you have forgotten, the more it eludes you, until, substituting in your mind the idea, I shall remember in a minute, to the idea, I have forgotten, the name comes back to you of its own accord without the least effort? Let those of you who are cyclists remember the days when you were learning to ride. You went along clutching the handlebars and frightened of falling. Suddenly, catching sight of the smallest obstacle in the road, you try to avoid it, and the more efforts you made to do so, the more surely you rushed upon it. Who has not suffered from an attack of uncontrollable laughter, which bursts out more violently the more one tries to control it? What was the state of mind of each person in these different circumstances? I do not want to fall, but I cannot help doing so. I want to sleep, but I cannot. I want to remember the name of Mrs. So-and-so, but I cannot. I want to avoid the obstacle, but I cannot. I want to stop laughing, but I cannot. As you see, in each of these conflicts, it is always the imagination which gains the victory over the will, without any exception. To the same order of ideas belongs the case of the leader who rushes forward to the head of his troops and always carries them along with him, while the cry, "Each man for himself," is almost certain to cause a defeat. Why is this? It is because in the first case, the men imagine they must go forward, and in the second, they imagine that they are conquered and must fly for their lives. Panurge was quite aware of the contagion of example, which is to say, the action of the imagination. I don't know who that is. When to avenge himself upon a merchant on board the same boat, he bought his biggest sheep and threw it into the sea, certain beforehand that the entire flock would follow, which indeed happened. I don't know anything about that. We human beings have a certain resemblance to sheep, and involuntarily we are irresistibly impelled to follow other people's example, imagining that we cannot do otherwise. I think we call that mass psychosis. I could quote 1,000 other examples, but I should fear to bore you by such an enumeration. I cannot, however, pass by in silence this fact, which shows the enormous power of the imagination, or in other words, of the unconscious in its struggle against the will. There are certain drunkards who wish to give up drinking, but who cannot do so. Ask them, and they will reply in all sincerity that they desire to be sober, that drink disgusts them, but they are irresistibly impelled to drink against their will, in spite of the harm they know it will do to them. In the same way, certain criminals commit crimes in spite of themselves, and when they are asked why they acted so, they answer, "I could not help it. Something impelled me. It was stronger than I." And the drunkard and the criminal speak the truth. They are forced to do what they do, for the simple reason they imagine they cannot prevent themselves from doing so. Thus, we who are so proud of our will, who believe nation. My apologies, Zoom cut out on me for a second. So thus, we who are so proud of our will, who believe that we are free to act as we like, are in reality nothing but wretched puppets of which our imagination holds all the strings. We only cease to be puppets when we have learned to guide our imagination. Suggestion and autosuggestion. According to the preceding remarks, we can compare the imagination to a torrent which fatally sweeps away the poor wretch who has fallen into it, in spite of his efforts to gain the bank. This torrent seems indomitable, but if you know how, you can turn it from the course and conduct it to the factory, and there you can transform its force into movement, heat, and electricity. If this simile is not enough, we may compare the imagination, the madman at home, as it has been called, to an unbroken horse, which has neither bridle nor reins. What can the rider do except let himself go wherever the horse wishes to take him? And often, if the latter runs away, his mad career only comes to an end in the ditch. If, however, the rider succeeds in putting a bridle on the horse, the parts are reversed, and it is no longer the horse who goes where he likes. It is the rider who obliges the horse to take him wherever he wishes to go. Now that we have learned to realize the enormous power of the unconscious or imaginative being, I'm going to show how this self, hitherto considered indomitable, can be as easily controlled as a torrent or an unbroken horse. But before going any further, it is necessary to define carefully two words that are often used without being properly understood. These are the words suggestion and autosuggestion. What then is suggestion? It may be defined as the act of imposing an idea on the brain of another. Does this action really exist? Properly speaking, no. Suggestion does not indeed exist by itself. It does not and cannot exist except on the sine qua non condition of transforming itself into autosuggestion in the subject. This latter word may be defined as the implanting of an idea in oneself by oneself. You may make a suggestion to someone. If the unconscious of the latter does not accept the suggestion, if it has not, as it were, digested it, in order to transform it into autosuggestion, it produces no result. I have myself occasionally made a more or less commonplace suggestion to ordinarily very obedient subjects quite unsuccessfully. The reason is that the unconscious of the subject refused to accept it and did not transform it into autosuggestion. The use of autosuggestion. Let us now return to the point where I said that we can control and lead our imagination, just as a torrent or an unbroken horse can be controlled. To do so, it is enough in the first place to know that this is possible, of which fact most everyone is ignorant. And secondly, to know by what means it can be done. Well, the means is very simple. It is that which we have used every day since we came into the world, without wishing or knowing it, and absolutely unconsciously, but which unfortunately for us, we often use wrongly and to our own detriment. This means is autosuggestion. Whereas we constantly give ourselves unconscious autosuggestions, all we have to do is to give ourselves conscious ones. And the process consists in this. First, to weigh carefully in one's mind the things which are to be the object of the autosuggestion. And according as they require the answer yes or no, to repeat several times without thinking of anything else. This thing is coming, or this thing is going away, this thing will or will not happen, etc., etc. If the unconscious accepts this suggestion and transforms it into an auto-suggestion, the thing or things are realized in every particular. Thus understood, autosuggestion is nothing but hypnotism as I see it, and I would define it in these simple words: the influence of the imagination upon the moral and physical being of mankind. Now, this influence is undeniable, and without returning to previous examples, I will quote a few others. If you persuade yourself that you can do a certain thing, provided this thing is possible or reasonable, you will do it however difficult it may be. If, on the contrary, you imagine that you cannot do the simplest thing in the world, it is impossible for you to do it, and molehills become for you unscalable mountains. Such is the case of neurasthenics, those are people who are depressed, who, believing themselves incapable of the least effort, often find it impossible even to walk a few steps without being exhausted. And these same neurasthenics sink more deeply into their depression the more efforts they make to throw it off, like the poor wretch in the quicksands who sinks in all the deeper the more he tries to struggle out. In the same way, it is sufficient to think a pain is going, to feel indeed disappear little by little, and inversely, it is enough to think that one suffers in order to feel the pain begin to come immediately. I know certain people who predict in advance that they will have a sick headache on a certain day in certain circumstances, and on that day, in the given circumstances, sure enough, they feel it. They brought their illness on themselves, just as others cure theirs by conscious autosuggestion. I know that one generally passes for mad in the eyes of the world if one dares to put forward ideas which we are not accustomed to hear. Well, at the risk of being thought so, I say that if certain people are ill mentally and physically, it is that they imagine themselves to be ill mentally or physically. If certain others are paralytic without having any lesion to account for it, it is that they imagine themselves to be paralyzed, and it is among such persons that the most extraordinary cures are produced. If others again are happy or unhappy, it is that they imagine themselves to be so, for it is possible for two people in exactly the same circumstances to be, one perfectly happy and the other absolutely wretched. Neurasthenia, stammering, aversions, kleptomania, certain cases of paralysis are nothing but the result of unconscious autosuggestion. That is to say, the result of the action of the unconscious upon the physical and moral being. But if our unconscious is the source of many of our ills, it can also bring about the cure of our physical and mental ailments. It can not only repair the ill it has done, but cure real illnesses, so strong is its action upon our organism. Shut yourself up alone in a room, seat yourself in an armchair, close your eyes to avoid any distraction, and concentrate your mind for a few moments on thinking, such and such a thing is going to disappear, or such and such a thing is coming to pass. If you have really made the autosuggestion, that is to say, if your unconscious has assimilated the idea that you have presented to it, you are astonished to see you have thought that the thing you have thought has come to pass. Note that it is the property of ideas autosuggested to exist within us unrecognized, and we can only know of their existence by the effect they produce. But above all, and this is an essential point, the will must not be brought into play in practicing autosuggestion, for if it is not in agreement with the imagination, if one thinks, I will make such and such a thing happen, and the imagination says, you are willing it, but it's not going to be, not only does one not obtain what one wants, but even exactly the reverse is brought about. This remark is of capital importance and explains why results are so unsatisfactory when, in treating moral ailments, one strives to re-educate the will. It is the training of the imagination which is necessary, and it is thanks to this shade of difference that my method has often succeeded where others, and those not the least considered, have failed. From the numerous experiments that I have made daily for 20 years, and which I have examined with minute care, I have been able to deduct the following conclusions, which I have summed up as laws. 1. When the will and the imagination are antagonistic, it is always the imagination which wins, without any exception. 2. In the conflict between the will and the imagination, the force of the imagination is in direct ratio to the square of the will. When the will and the imagination are in agreement, one does not add to the other, but one is multiplied by the other. 4. The imagination can be directed. And he says, the expressions in direct ratio to the square of the will and is multiplied by are not rigorously exact. They are simply illustrations destined to make my meaning clearer. After what has just been said, it would seem that nobody ought to be ill. That is quite true. Every illness, whatever it may be, can yield to autosuggestion. Daring and unlikely as my statement may seem, I do not say it does always yield, but can yield, which is a different thing. But in order to lead people to practice conscious autosuggestion, they must be taught how, just as they are taught to read or write or play the piano. Autosuggestion is, as I said above, an instrument that we possess at birth, with which we play unconsciously all of our life, as a baby plays with its rattle. It is, however, a dangerous instrument. It can wound or even kill you if you handle it imprudently and unconsciously. It can, on the contrary, save your life when you know how to employ it consciously. One can say of it as Aesop said of the tongue, it is at the same time the best and the worst thing in the world. How to teach patients to make autosuggestions. I am now going to show you how everyone can profit by the beneficent action of autosuggestion, consciously applied. In saying everyone, I exaggerate a little, for there are two classes of persons in whom it is difficult to arouse conscious autosuggestion. 1, the mentally undeveloped who are not capable of understanding what you say to them. And 2, those who are unwilling to understand. The principle of the method may be summed up in these few words. It is impossible to think of two things at once. That is to say that two ideas may be in juxtaposition, but they cannot be superimposed in our mind. Every thought entirely filling our mind becomes true for us and tends to transform itself into action. Thus, if you can make a sick person think that her trouble is getting better, it will disappear. If you succeed in making a kleptomaniac think that he will not steal anymore, he will cease to steal, etc., etc. This training, which perhaps seems to you an impossibility, is, however, the simplest thing in the world. It is enough, by a series of appropriate and graduated experiments, to teach the subject, as it were, the ABC of conscious thought. And here is the series. By following it to the letter, one can be absolutely sure of obtaining a good result, except with the two categories of persons mentioned above. First experiment, preparatory. Ask the subject to stand upright with the body as stiff as an iron bar, the feet close together from toe to heel, while keeping the ankles flexible as if they were hinges. Tell him to make himself like a plank with hinges at its base, which is balanced on the ground. Make him notice that if one pushes the plank slightly either way, it falls as a mass without any resistance in the direction in which it is pushed. Tell him that you're going to pull him back by the shoulders and that he must let himself fall in your arms without the slightest resistance, turning on his ankles as on hinges. That is to say, keeping the feet fixed to the ground. Then pull him back by the shoulders, and if the experiment does not succeed, repeat it until it does, or nearly so. Second experiment. Begin by explaining to the subject that in order to demonstrate the action of the imagination upon us, you are going to ask him in a moment to think, I'm falling backwards, I'm falling backwards. Tell him that he must have no thought but this in his mind, that he must not reflect or wonder if he is going to fall or not, or think that if he falls, he may hurt himself, etc., or fall back purposely to please you, but that if he really feels something impelling him to fall backwards, he must not resist but obey the impulse, and of course you have to catch him. Then ask your subject to raise the head high and to shut his eyes, and place your right fist on the back of his neck and your left hand on his forehead, and say to him, now think, I'm falling backwards, etc. And indeed, you are falling backwards. You are falling backwards, etc. At the same time, slide the left hand lightly backwards to the left temple above the ear and remove very slowly, but with a continuous movement, the right fist. The subject is immediately felt to make a slight movement backwards and either to stop himself from falling or else to fall completely. In the first case, tell him that he has resisted and that he did not think just that he was falling, but that he might hurt himself if he did fall. That is true, for if he had not thought the latter, he would have fallen like a block. Repeat the experiment using a tone of command as if you would force the subject to obey you. Go on with it until it is completely successful or very nearly so. The operator should stand a little behind the subject, the left leg forward and the right leg well behind him, so as not to be knocked over by the subject when he falls. Neglect of this precaution might result in a double fall if the person is heavy. Okay, so I have to interrupt here. You have to catch people. I have found better ways to do this, which I'll describe later, but these are ways to see if the person is susceptible or capable of autosuggesting. Okay. Third experiment. Place the subject facing you, the body still stiff, the ankles flexible, and the feet joined and parallel. Put your two hands on his temples without any pressure. Look fixedly, without moving, the eyelids at the root of his nose and tell him to think, I'm falling forward, I'm falling forward. And repeat to him, stressing the syllables, you are falling forward. You are falling forward, without ceasing to look fixedly at him. Fourth experiment. Ask the subject to clasp his hands as tight as possible, that is to say, until the fingers tremble slightly. Look at him in the same way as in the preceding experiment and keep your hands on his as though to squeeze them together still more tightly. Tell him to think that he cannot unclasp his fingers, that you are going to count 3, and that when you say 3, he is to try to separate his hands while thinking all the time, I cannot do it, I cannot do it, and he will find it impossible. Then count very slowly 1, 2, 3, and add immediately, detaching the syllables, you cannot do it. You cannot do it. If the subject is thinking properly, I cannot do it, not only is he unable to separate his fingers, but the latter clasp themselves all the more tightly together, the more efforts he makes to separate them. He obtains, in fact, exactly the contrary to what he wants. In a few moments, say to him, now think, I can do it, and his fingers will separate themselves. Be careful always to keep your eyes fixed on the root of the subject's nose, and do not allow him to turn his eyes away from yours for a single moment. If he is able to unclasp his hands, do not think it is your own fault. It is the subject's. He has not properly thought, I cannot. Assure him firmly of this and begin the experiment again. Always use a tone of command which suffers no disobedience. I do not mean that it is necessary to raise your voice. On the contrary, it is preferable to employ the ordinary pitch, but stress every word in a dry and imperative tone. When these experiments have been successful, all the others succeed equally well and can be easily obtained by carrying out to the letter the instructions given above. Now, I have to interrupt here again. The world of hypnotism has advanced so far in 100 years and I took a hypnotism class. All I need to do is ask a client to lay down or be comfortable and close their eyes and do this whole experiment, having them not be able to open their eyes. So no one's at risk of falling and things like that. So clasping of hands and eyes, being stuck shut, you can do that with ease without harming either you or the client. Back to him. Some subjects are very sensitive, and it is easy to recognize them by the fact that the contraction of their fingers and limbs is easily produced. After 2 or 3 successful experiments, it is no longer necessary to think to them, think this or think that. You need only, for example, say to them, but in the imperative tone employed by all good suggestions, close your hands. Now you cannot open them. Shut your eyes now. Now you cannot open them. I think that's sufficient. Liz here. The subject finds it absolutely impossible to open the hands or the eyes in spite of all his efforts. Tell him in a few moments, you can do it now, and the decontraction takes place instantaneously. These experiments can be varied to infinity. Here are a few more. Make the subject join his hands and suggest that they are welded together. Make him put his hand on the table and suggest that it is stuck to it. Tell him that he is fixed to his chair and cannot rise. Make him rise and tell him he cannot walk. Put a pen holder on the table and tell him that it weighs 100 pounds and that he cannot lift it, etc., etc. In all these experiments, I cannot repeat too often, it is not suggestion properly so-called which produces the phenomena, but autosuggestion, which is consecutive to the suggestion of the operator. Like I said, this is Liz, the world of hypnotism has gone so far, there's those stage hypnotists that make people do silly things in Las Vegas, and there are people who actually could hypnotize people, and they've done it with dogs as well, where they can actually have surgery without anesthesia and stuff like that. And have dental work without anesthesia. Method of procedure and curative suggestion. When the subject has passed through the preceding experiments and has understood them, he is ripe for curative suggestion. He is like a cultivated field in which the seed can germinate and develop, whereas before it was but tough, rough earth in which it would have perished. Whatever ailment the subject suffers from, whether it is physical or mental, it is important to proceed always in the same way and to use the same words with a few variations according to the case. Now here I begin some verbiage that you can copy and use for yourself. And as before mentioned, I'm going to make a separate video that you can just listen to, or you can, record it for yourself. Here we go. Say to the subject, sit down and close your eyes. I am not going to try and put you to sleep, as it is quite unnecessary. I ask you to close your eyes simply in order that your attention may not be distracted by the objects around you. Now tell yourself that every word I say is going to fix itself in your mind and be printed, engraved, and encrusted in it, that there it is going to stay fixed, imprinted, encrusted, and that without your will or knowledge, in fact, perfectly unconsciously on your part, you yourself and your whole organism are going to obey. In the first place, I say that every day, 3 times a day, in the morning, at midday, and in the evening, at the usual meal times, you will feel hungry. That is to say, you will experience the agreeable sensation which makes you think and say, oh, how nice it will be to have something to eat. You will then eat and enjoy your food without, of course, overeating. You will also be careful to masticate it properly so as to transform it into a soft paste before swallowing it. In these conditions, you will digest it properly and so feel no discomfort, inconvenience, or pain of any kind, either in the stomach or intestines. You will assimilate what you eat, and your organism will make use of it to make blood, muscle, strength, and energy. In a word, life. Since you will have digested your food properly, the function of excretion will be normal, and every morning on rising, you will feel the need of evacuating the bowels, and without ever being obliged to take medicine or use any artifice, you will obtain a normal and satisfactory result. Further, every night from the time you wish to go to sleep till the time you wish to wake next morning, you will sleep deeply, calmly, and quietly, without nightmares. And on waking, you will feel perfectly well, cheerful, and active. Likewise, if you occasionally suffer from depression, if you are gloomy and prone to worry and look on the dark side of things, from now onwards, you will cease to do so. And instead of worrying and being depressed and looking on the dark side of things, you're going to feel perfectly cheerful, possibly without any special reason for it, just as you used to feel depressed for no particular reason. I say further still that even if you have real reason to be worried and depressed, you are not going to be so. If you're also subject to occasional fits of impatience or ill temper, you will cease to have them. On the contrary, you'll always be patient and master of yourself, and the things which worried, annoyed, or irritated you will henceforth leave you absolutely indifferent and perfectly calm. If you are sometimes attacked, pursued, haunted by bad and unwholesome ideas, by apprehensions, fears, aversions, and temptations, or grudges against other people, all that will be gradually lost sight of by your imagination and will melt away and lose itself as though in a distant cloud, where it will finally disappear completely. As a dream vanishes when we wake, so will all these vain images disappear. To this I add that all your organs are performing their functions properly. The heart beats in a normal way, and the circulation of the blood takes place as it should. The lungs are carrying out their functions, as also are the stomach, the intestines, the liver, the biliary duct, the kidneys, and the bladder. If at the present moment any of them is acting abnormally, that abnormality is becoming less every day, so that quite soon it will have vanished completely, and the organ will have recovered its normal function. Further, if there should be any lesions in any of these organs, they will get better from day to day and will soon be entirely healed. With regard to this, I may say that it is not necessary to know which organ is affected for it to be cured. Under the influence of the autosuggestion, every day, in every respect, I am getting better and better. The unconscious acts upon the organ which it can pick out for itself. I must also add, and it is extremely important, that if up to the present you have lacked confidence in yourself, I tell you that this self-distrust will disappear little by little and give place to self-confidence based on the knowledge of this force of incalculable power, which is in each one of us. It is absolutely necessary for every human being to have this confidence. Without it, one can accomplish nothing. With it, one can accomplish whatever one likes, within reason, of course. You are then going to have confidence in yourself, and this confidence gives you the assurance that you are capable of accomplishing perfectly well whatever you wish to do, on condition that it is reasonable and whatever it is your duty to do. So, when you wish to do something reasonable, or when you have a duty to perform, always think that it is easy and make the words difficult, impossible, I cannot, it is stronger than I cannot prevent myself from ... disappear from your vocabulary. They are not English. What is English is, it is easy and I can. By considering the thing easy becomes so for you, although it might seem difficult to others. You will do it quickly and well and without fatigue because you do it without effort. Whereas if you had considered it as difficult or impossible, it would have become so for you simply because you would have thought it so. To these general suggestions, which will perhaps seem long and even childish to some of you, but which are necessary, must be added those which apply to the particular case of the patient you are dealing with. All these suggestions must be made in a monotonous and soothing voice, always emphasizing the essential words, which, although it does not actually send the subject to sleep, at least makes him feel drowsy and think of nothing in particular. When you have come to the end of the series of suggestions, you address the subject in these terms. In short, I mean that from every point of view, physical as well as mental, you are going to enjoy excellent health, better health than that you have been able to enjoy up to the present. Now I'm going to count to 3, and when I say 3, you will open your eyes and come out of the passive state in which you are now. You will come out of it quite naturally without feeling in the least drowsy or tired. On the contrary, you will feel strong, vigorous, alert, active, full of life. Further still, you will feel very cheerful and fit in every way. 1, 2, 3. At the word 3, the subject opens his eyes, always with a smile and expression of well-being and contentment on his face. Sometimes, although rarely, the patient is cured on the spot. At other times, and this is more generally the case, he finds himself relieved. His pain or his depression has partially or totally disappeared, though only for a certain lapse of time. He actually, in another book, talks about, hey, you wouldn't take a pill one time and expect it to cure you, so don't expect it the same of autosuggestion. So he says, in every case, it is necessary to renew the suggestions more or less frequently according to your subject, being carefully always to space them out at longer and longer intervals according to the progress obtained until they are no longer necessary. That is to say, when the cure is complete. Before sending away your patient, you must tell him that he carries within him the instrument by which he can cure himself, and that you are, as it were, only a professor teaching him to use this instrument, and that he must help you in your task. Thus, every morning before rising, and every night on getting into bed, he must shut his eyes, and in thought transport himself into your presence, and then repeat 20 times consecutively in a monotonous tone, counting by means of a string with 20 little knots in it, this little phrase: every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. People also say every day in every respect, I'm getting better and better. In his mind, he should emphasize the words in every way, which applies to every need, mental or physical. This general suggestion is more efficacious than special ones. Thus, it is easy to realize the part played by the giver of the suggestions. He is not a master who gives orders, but a friend, a guide, who leads the patient step by step on the road to health. As all of the suggestions are given in the interest of the patient, the unconscious of the latter asks nothing better than to assimilate them and transform them into autosuggestions. When this has been done, the cure is obtained more or less rapidly according to the circumstances. The superiority of this method. This method gives absolutely marvelous results, and it is easy to understand why. Indeed, by following out my advice, it is impossible to fail, except with the two classes of persons mentioned above, who fortunately represent barely 3% of the whole. If, however, you try to put your subjects to sleep right away, without the explanations and preliminary experiments necessary to bring them to accept the suggestions and to transform them into autosuggestions, you cannot and will not succeed except with peculiarly sensitive subjects, and these are rare. Everybody may become so by training, but very few are so sufficiently without the preliminary instructions that I recommend, which can be done in a few minutes. Formerly, imagining that suggestions could only be given during sleep, I always tried to put my patient to sleep. But on discovering that it was not indispensable, I left off doing it in order to spare him the dread and uneasiness he almost always experiences when he is told that he is going to be sent off to sleep, which often makes him off in spite of himself, an involuntary resistance. If, on the contrary, you tell him that you are not going to put him to sleep, as there is no need to do so, you gain his confidence. He listens to you without fear or any ulterior thought, and it often happens, if not the first time, anyhow very soon, that, soothed by the monotonous tone of your voice, he falls into a deep sleep from which he awakens, astonished at having slept at all. If there are skeptics among you, as I'm quite sure there are, all I have to say to them is, come to my house and see what is being done, and you'll be convinced by fact. You must not, however, run away with the idea that autosuggestion can be only brought about in the way I've described. It is possible to make suggestions to people without their knowledge and without any preparation. For instance, if a doctor who by his title alone has suggestive influence on his patient tells him that he can do nothing for him and that his illness is incurable, he provokes in the mind of the latter an autosuggestion which may have the most disastrous consequences. If, however, he tells him that his illness is a serious one, it is true, but that with care, time, and patience he can be cured, he sometimes and even often obtains results which will surprise him. Here is another example. If a doctor, after examining his patient, writes a prescription and gives it to him without any comment, the remedies prescribed will not have much chance of succeeding. If, on the other hand, he explains to his patient that such and such medicines must be taken in such and such conditions and that they will produce certain results, those results are practically certain to be brought about, right? We all know about that. If in this hall there are medical men or brother chemists, I hope they will not think me their enemy. I am, on the contrary, their best friend. On the one hand, I should like to see the theoretical and practical study of suggestion on the syllabus of the medical schools for the great benefit of the sick and of the doctors themselves. And on the other hand, in my opinion, every time that a patient goes to see his doctor, the latter should order him one or several medicines, even if they're not necessary. I mean, you could use sugar pills or something like that. As a matter of fact, when a patient visits his doctor, it is in order to be told what medicine will cure him. He does not realize that it is the hygiene and regimen which do this, and he attaches little importance to them. It is a medicine, that's what he wants. In my opinion, if the doctor only prescribes a regimen without any medicine, his patient will be dissatisfied. He will say that he took the trouble to consult him for nothing and often goes to another doctor. It seems to me that the doctor should always prescribe the medicines to his patient, and as much as possible, medicines made up by himself, rather than the standard remedies so much advertised, and which owe their only value to the advertisement. The doctor's own prescriptions will inspire infinitely more confidence than so-and-so's pills, which anyone can procure easily at the nearest drugstore without any need of prescription. How suggestion works. In order to understand properly the part played by suggestion, or rather by autosuggestion, it is enough to know that the unconscious self is the grand director of all our functions. Make this believed, as I said above, that a certain organ which does not function well must perform its functions, and instantly the order is transmitted. The organ obeys with docility, and either at once or little by little performs its function in a normal manner. This explains simply and clearly how, by means of suggestion, one can stop hemorrhages, cure constipation, cause fibrous tumors to disappear, cure paralysis, tubercular lesions, varicose ulcers, etc. Let us take, for example, the case of dental hemorrhage, which I had the opportunity of observing in the consulting room of Monsieur Gaudet, a dentist in Troyes. A young lady whom I had helped to cure herself of asthma, from which she had suffered for 8 years, told me one day that she wanted to have a tooth out. As I knew her to be very sensitive, I offered to make her feel nothing of the operation. She naturally accepted with pleasure, and we made an appointment with the dentist. On the day we had arranged, we presented ourselves at the dentist's, and standing opposite my patient, I looked fixedly at her, saying, "You feel nothing, you feel nothing." And then, while still continuing the suggestion, I made a sign to the dentist. In an instant, the tooth was out without Mademoiselle D turning a hair. As fairly often happens, a hemorrhage followed. But I told the dentist that I would try suggestion without his using a hemostatic. Without knowing beforehand what would happen, I then asked Mademoiselle D to look at me fixedly, and I suggested to her that in 2 minutes the hemorrhage would cease of its own accord, and we waited. The patient spat blood again once or twice and then ceased. I told her to open her mouth, and we both looked and found that a clot of blood had formed in the dental cavity. How is this phenomenon to be explained? In the simplest way. Under the influence of the idea, the hemorrhage is to stop. The unconscious has sent to the small arteries and veins the order to stop the flow of blood, and obediently they contracted naturally, as they would have done artificially at the contact of a hemostatic, like adrenaline, for example. The same reasoning explains how a fibrous tumor can be made to disappear. The unconscious, having accepted the idea, it is to go. The brain orders the arteries which nourish it to contract. They do so, refusing their services, and ceasing to nourish the tumor which, deprived of nourishment, dies, dries up, and is reabsorbed and disappears. The use of suggestion for the cure of moral ailments and taints, either congenitally or acquired. Here, taints means something undesirable, not the Urban Dictionary meaning. Neurasthenia, so common nowadays, generally generally yields to suggestion constantly practiced in the way I have indicated. I have had the happiness of contributing to the cure of a large number of neurasthenics with whom every other treatment had failed. One of them even spent a month in a special establishment in Luxembourg without obtaining any improvement. In 6 weeks, he was completely cured, and he is now the happiest man one would wish to find after having thought himself the most miserable. Neither is he ever likely to fall ill again in the same way, for I showed him how to make use of conscious autosuggestion, and he does it marvelously well. But if suggestion is useful in treating moral complaints and physical ailments, may it not render still greater services to society in turning into honest folks the wretched children who people our reformatories and who only leave them to enter the army of crime? Let no one tell me it is impossible. The remedy exists, and I can prove it. I will quote the 2 following cases, which are very characteristic, but here I must insert a few remarks in parentheses. To make you understand the way in which suggestion acts in the treatment of moral taints, I will use the following comparison. Suppose our brain is a plank in which are driven nails, which represent the ideas, habits, and instincts which determine our actions. If we find that there exists in a subject a bad idea, a bad habit, a bad instinct, as it were, a bad nail, we take another one, which is the good idea, habit, or instinct, place it on top of the bad one, and give a tap with a hammer. In other words, we make a suggestion. The new nail will be driven in perhaps a fraction of an inch, while the old one will come out to the same extent. At each fresh blow with the hammer, that is to say, at each fresh suggestion, the one will be driven in a fraction further, and the other will be driven out in the same amount until, after a certain number of blows, the old nail will come out completely and be replaced by the new one. When this substitution has been made, the individual obeys it. Let us return to our examples. Little Monsieur M, a child of 11 living in Troyes, was subject night and day to certain accidents inherent to early infancy. He was also a kleptomaniac and, of course, untruthful into the bargain. At his mother's request, I treated him by suggestion. After the first visits, the accidents ceased by day. So he's talking about urination at night, but he's being euphemistic. After the first visit, the accidents ceased by day, but continued at night. Little by little, they became less frequent, and finally, a few months afterwards, the child was completely cured. In the same period, his thieving propensities lessened, and in 6 months they had entirely ceased. This child's brother, aged 18, had conceived a violent hatred against another of his brothers. Every time that he had taken a little too much wine, he felt impelled to draw a knife and stab his brother. Oh my goodness. He felt that one day or other he would end by doing so, and he knew at the same time that having done so, he would be inconsolable. I treated him also by suggestion, and the result was marvelous. After the first treatment, he was cured. His hatred for his brother had disappeared, and they have since become good friends and got on capitally together. I followed up the case for a long time, and the cure was permanent. Since such results are to be obtained by suggestion, would it not be beneficial, I might even say indispensable, to take up this method and introduce it into our reformatories? I'm absolutely convinced that if suggestions were daily applied to vicious children, more than 50% could be reclaimed. Would it not be an immense service to render society to bring back to it sane and well members of it who were formerly corroded by moral decay? Perhaps I shall be told that suggestion is a dangerous thing and that it can be used for evil purposes. This is no valid objection, first because the practice of suggestion would only be confided by the patient to reliable and honest people, to the reformatory doctors, for instance, and on the other hand, those who seek to use it for evil ask no one's permission. But even admitting that it offers some danger, which is not so, I should like to ask whoever proffers the objection to tell me what thing we use that is not dangerous. Is it steam, gunpowder, railways, ships, electricity, automobiles, airplanes? Are the poisons not dangerous which we doctors and chemists use daily in minute doses, which might easily destroy the patient if in a moment's carelessness we unfortunately made a mistake in weighing them out? Well, believe it or not, that was the whole first chapter. The second chapter goes into many examples of the healings. I'm going to skip those for now. You can read them in the book, but they're tedious to read. If you want to get the book, you can read them. The third chapter is called Thoughts and Precepts, and I'm going to read this. Just some thoughts he had have been recorded. Do not spend your time in thinking of illness you might have, for if you have no real ones, you will create artificial ones. When you make conscious autosuggestions, do it naturally, simply, with conviction, and above all, without any effort. If unconscious and bad autosuggestions are so often realized, it is because they are made without effort. Be sure that you will obtain what you want, and you will obtain it, as long as it is within reason. To become master of oneself, it is enough to think that one is becoming so. Your hands tremble, your steps falter. Tell yourself that it's all going to cease, and little by little it will disappear. It is not in me, but in yourself that you must have confidence, for it is in yourself alone that dwells the force which can cure you. My part simply consists in teaching you to make use of that force. Never discuss things you know nothing about, or you will only make yourself ridiculous. Things which seem miraculous to you have a perfectly natural cause. If they seem extraordinary, it is only because the cause escapes you. When you know that, you realize that nothing could be more natural. When the will and the imagination are in conflict, it is always the imagination which wins. Such a case is only too frequent, and then not only do we not do what we want, but just the contrary of what we want. For example, the more we try to go to sleep, the more we try to remember the name of someone, the more we try to stop laughing, the more we try to avoid an obstacle, while thinking that we cannot do so. The more excited we become, the less we can remember the name, the more uncontrollable our laughter becomes, and the more surely we rush upon the obstacle. It is then the imagination and not the will which is the most important faculty of man. And thus it is a serious mistake to advise people to train their wills. It is the training of their imaginations that they ought to set about. Things are not for us what they are, but what they seem. This explains the contradictory evidence of persons speaking in all good faith. By believing oneself to be the master of one's thoughts, one becomes so. Every one of our thoughts, good or bad, becomes concrete, materializes, and becomes, in short, a reality. We are what we make ourselves, and not what circumstances make us. Whoever starts off in life with the idea, I shall succeed, always does succeed because he does what is necessary to bring about this result. If only one opportunity presents itself to him, and if this opportunity has, as it were, only one hair on its head, he seizes it by that one hair. Further, he often brings about, unconsciously or not, propitious circumstances. He who, on the contrary, always doubts himself, never succeeds in doing anything. He might find himself in the midst of an army of opportunities, with heads of hair like Absalom, and yet he would not see them, and could not even seize a single hair, even if he had only to stretch out his hand in order to do so. And if he brings about circumstances, they are generally unfavorable ones. Do not blame fate. You have only yourself to blame. People are always preaching the doctrine of effort, but this idea must be repudiated. Effort means will, and will means the possible entrance of the imagination in opposition, and the bringing about of exactly contrary result of the desired one. Always think that what you have to do is easy, if possible. In this state of mind, you will not spend more of your strength than just what is necessary. If you consider it difficult, you will spend 10, 20 times more strength than you need. In other words, you will waste it. Autosuggestion is an instrument which you have to learn how to use, just as you would for any other instrument. An excellent gun in experienced hands only gives wretched results, but the more skilled the same hands become, the more easily they place the bullets in the target. Conscious autosuggestion made with confidence, with faith, with perseverance, realizes itself mathematically within reason. When certain people do not obtain satisfactory results with autosuggestion, it is either because they lack confidence or because they make efforts, which is the more frequent case. To make good suggestions, it is absolutely necessary to do it without effort. The latter implies the use of the will, which must be entirely put aside. One must have recourse exclusively to the imagination. Many people who have taken care of their health all their life in vain imagine that they can be immediately cured by autosuggestion. It is a mistake, for is it not unreasonable to think so? Can't say that sentence. It is no use expecting from suggestion more than could be normally produced. That is, I'm going to start this over again. It is a mistake, for it is not reasonable to think so. It is no use expecting from suggestion more than it can normally produce. That is to say, a progressive improvement which little by little transform itself into complete cure when that is possible. All right, so what he's saying here is crazy. It's basically like, don't expect it to happen fast, like you wouldn't expect other medicines to work perfectly well. So don't expect miracles from this. It may take some time. Okay, phew. The means employed by the healers all go back to autosuggestion. That is to say that these methods, whatever they are, words, incantations, gestures, staging, all produce in the patient the autosuggestion of recovery. I agree with that. Every illness has two aspects unless it is exclusively a mental one. Indeed, on every physical illness, a mental one comes and attaches itself. If we give to the physical illness the coefficient 1, the mental illness may have the coefficient 1, 2, 10, 20, 50, 100, and more. In many cases, this can disappear instantaneously. And if its coefficient is a very high one, 100 for instance, while that of the physical ailment is 1, only the latter is left, 101st of the total illness. Such a thing is called a miracle, and yet there's nothing miraculous about it. What he's suggesting here is that actually physical ailments can be actually very much easier than mental or spiritual ones. We think that physical illness actually condenses down from spiritual or mental illness. Contrary to common opinion, physical diseases are generally far more easily cured than mental ones. Oh, I just said that. Buffon used to say, style is the man. We would put it in that man is what he thinks. The fear of failure is almost certain to cause failure, in the same way as the idea of success brings success and enables one always to surmount the obstacles that may be met with. Conviction is as necessary to the suggester as to his subject. It is this conviction, this faith, which enables him to obtain results where all other means have failed. It is not the person who acts, it is the method. Contrary to general opinion, suggestion or autosuggestion can bring about the cure of organic lesions. Formerly, it was believed that hypnotism could only be applied to the treatment of nervous illnesses. Its domain is far greater than that. It is true that hypnotism acts through the intermediary of the nervous system, but the nervous system dominates the whole organism. The muscles are set in movement by the nerves. The nerves regulate the circulation by their direct action on the heart, and by their action on the blood vessels, which they dilate or contract. The nerves act then on all the organs, and by their intermediation, all the unhealthy organs may be affected. Moral influence has a considerable value as a help in healing. It is a factor of the first order, which would be very wrong to neglect, since in medicine, as in every other branch of human activity, it is the spiritual voices which lead the world. Okay, I'm going to stop there. The language is getting very archaic, and there's other doctors who were quoted living in France at the time, getting a little crazy. But I just think that it's very useful information to have this old-timey author who's one of the people who invented affirmations and things like that. I mean, Aristotle and Pythagoras and so forth truly did, or maybe people before them. But here you have Emile Coué rehashing it or bringing it back to the forefront in 1922. Again, the language is archaic, it's male dominated. It's he says some things that are very iffy and chancy, like let's go to the reformatories and program everybody. And yeah, it may feel unpleasant to some, but I think it's very useful to have this and have these ideas and also understand these main points, which are you don't have to put someone to sleep or in a deep hypnotic trance. You can simply put them into a light alpha state. You can have them lay on the couch or sit in a chair. I've done this successfully with clients. You can count from 1 to 3. And if you do the testing with the clasping of hands, say, or the eyes being shut and they can't open them, you can find for yourself how autosuggestible someone is. And so I just want to stop there. And if my botched reading isn't enough to get you to get an electronic copy of this, I would say go ahead and do it. That'll be very useful for you. I want to bring up some other areas of the book that can be very, very useful. The first is on sleeping more easily. He suggests that when you fall asleep more easily, of course, you need good sleep hygiene, like get your get your phones, etc., out of the room and stuff like that. I can't talk tonight. I might redo this in the morning, but do the normal modern sleep hygiene that you've been taught. But you can also just begin to tell yourself in a nice light voice, I'm going to sleep. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to sleep. I'm working on this myself now. And so you can try that if it's helpful. The other thing is, if you have immediate body pains and stuff like that, you can simply say, this is passing, or this is going away, or this too shall pass, which is a Bible verse. But he suggests you simply use the French, which is ça passe. Ça is this. Ça passe, ça passe, ça passe, ça passe. You put your hand over the hurting area or your migraine or wherever, because he says it's short. So, your subconscious understands French as well. And by the way, what he calls unconscious, I refer to as subconscious. Same thing, maybe not quite, but for all intents and purposes. You can put your hands or think about the area that's in pain and say, ça passe, ça passe, ça passe, ça passe, or say, this is passing, it's passing, it's passing, it's going away, or this too shall pass, whatever works for you. I say ça passe, but I'm French, so I like it. The third thing I want to mention is that if you're raising children, you can actually go into their room for their best, for their best and highest good, and not waking them up. You can simply speak over them kindly. You will not wet the bed, or you're happy in school, you're content, you're happy. I mean, not to order them around like little automatons, but you can say, you feel so much better, you're so healthy and strong, you're so beautiful and amazing. I do this with my own grandchildren as they're asleep on my chest. I tell them amazing things and that they're strong and healthy and wonderful and amazing. So it's really great for children, again, not to control people, but to, if you have their best and highest interests in mind, you can help them with their ailments and stuff like that, or if they're stealing and things like that. I learned that a little late in life, but anyway, here we are. I want to thank you for listening to me read that. For me, it was very long, but for a very short little book. I like to provide very different sources because there's so many mindset coaches out there, and they're all looking at Neville Goddard, and they're great creators, but I'm looking at poking into things and finding very unique things for your perusal and for your consideration. Blessings to you. Take care. Bye-bye.